Tradition, trade, and culture have connected Europe and China for hundreds of years.
In the 18th century, a small number of products escaped from China and lit a touch paper in the West of excitement.
In this special series, we'll uncover the intertwined social and cultural histories of Europe and China, from the ancient Silk Road to the modern era.
Art is traveling as a silent ambassador to spread the word about culture and civilization.
It's amazingly impressive because they were such incredibly talented artists.
When you talk about silk, with a value of 3 or 4 garments, you could buy a palace.
We'll be seeking out the European spaces where traces of China lie hidden in plain sight.
Wow! This is the Chinese room, and it's definitely one of my favorites within the house.
Welcome to Traces of China. Gosh, they smell absolutely amazing. I mean, what could be more English, right?
There are not many art forms which the British can actually claim to have invented, and the landscape garden is possibly one of them. But only in a European context. Once you look at the world context, then of course the Chinese were there 2,000 years before.
English gardens are known for their wild, blooming flowers and a harmonious embrace of nature. But the roots of these carefully crafted landscapes can be traced far beyond the British Isles, deep into the ancient traditions of Chinese garden design. But what is a Chinese garden? Nestled in the heart of the English countryside is an unexpected treasure.
This is Chinese.
That's
Daphne
yes,
Phyllum.
Daphne Phyllum, yep. And this is another Chinese rose. Let's go along here.
Colin Little and Penny Sterling have completely reshaped their family home into the most remarkable homage to the 2,000-year-old art of Chinese garden design. Oh my goodness.
This is just a view into the garden, really. So
A threshold.
A threshold. This is exactly what the archway is all about. It's a threshold to go into the garden. Double dragon gateway, because it's got 2 little dragons up here.
I suppose for the uninitiated, how would you describe a Chinese garden?
Chinese gardens are supposed to be a mimic of the whole of nature. So that's why you need water, because you need a lake. You need mountains, so you have stones, and you need flowers and buildings as well. People talk of going to a Chinese garden as being a voyage of exploration, really. You're supposed to discover one garden after another after another. This is the garden of 10,000 shadows. Should the sun ever shine, coming through the beech tree, you get more than 10,000 shadows coming through. This is a Tang Dynasty poem, selected by a Chinese friend of ours who said, "You need poetry in a Chinese garden." My evening raft journey starts in the lake near the woods, when the insects sing and the reeds sigh. 10,000 shadows are cast by the moon's light, and 1,000 sounds rise in the autumn air. Now I have reached the evening of my life, and my longing for home is growing upon me. Beyond those floating clouds in the northwestern sky, what is the destination of the flowing river?
How
That's
terribly
it.
appropriate, seeing as
Yes.
how both of us are ancient.
It's
Oh man,
exactly,
it's
yeah.
moving though,
Yeah.
It is,
isn't
it
it?
is.
Wow. Why do you feel like you've been so deeply attracted to Chinese gardening and the whole ethos
Yeah,
behind
why?
it? I'm asking you too.
Why? I think it brings us back to the whole idea of making a garden as a miniature of the world. You've got your own little world. You've got the mountains and the lake and the rivers and the pathways and the buildings, and it's all in there.
much more than just pagodas and bridges, Chinese gardens are an exploration of what a garden can be. Ideas of how to be in nature, how to see it, and take pleasure in it.
That's a borrowed view.
It is a borrowed view.
That is a borrowed view if ever I saw one.
But how did these ideas become rooted in what is thought of as an English garden?
So the earliest record of Chinese gardens from Suzhou started from 500 BC. You can see it's developed for over 2,500 years.
Suzhou, often referred to as the Garden City, is renowned as the birthplace of classical Chinese gardens, where the ancient garden design principles were perfected and went on to inspire garden culture across China and the rest of the world.
Chinese gardens, they try to create this poetic and also philosophical atmosphere. So when you are in the Chinese garden, you should have this freedom of thinking beyond.
Dr. Wei Yang is an urban planning pioneer. Her work is focused on the harmonious integration of nature and human habitation, drawing inspiration from ancient Chinese philosophies.
I want to show you a very famous example of Chinese landscape painting. It was painted in Song Dynasty. It's year 1113. It's called The Scroll of 1,000 Miles of Rivers and Mountains.
God, it looks absolutely stunning. It's cinematic, isn't it?
The original copy is in the Forbidden City.
The Scroll of 1,000 Miles of Rivers and Mountains is a 12-meter-long masterpiece, often cited as one of the greatest achievements in Chinese art history.
The Chinese garden design is very much influenced by the Chinese landscape painting. Once you have seen this, you would really start to make philosophical connections between the Chinese landscape painting and the Chinese gardens.
Yeah, so there's that symbolic dimension. All of these are things that they're kind of primal attractions, aren't they?
From this painting, you can tell there are some very strong elements. So you would have rocks, which representing mountains, waters representing rivers, and also pavilions representing houses. So these are exactly the key 4 factors in the Chinese garden design. What Chinese garden try to create is not really replicate the real world, but actually the spiritual connections between the garden and the outside world. And also try to promote a sense of freedom. You wouldn't really trim the trees in that particular shape. You would really allow them to create this unique shape.
While this 900-year-old scroll would not have been directly known of in the UK, principles it embodies would later serve as an inspiration for a new fashion of landscape garden design. What would the contrast have been back in the day before the kind of arrival of some of this new Chinese style?
If you would imagine at the time, the British garden design was very much influenced by the French style. So it's highly controlled into symmetrical shapes. Naturalistic is not only about using natural elements, it's really about how you put them together and then how you present them.
So they're going from a world that is very axial,
controlled,
symmetrical,
into these random lines, elegance. But actually, these lines are highly controlled. These elegant lines is more difficult than the straight line. You really have to train your hands and also have to train your eyes. So I think this Chinese philosophy and the Chinese culture trained the Chinese people to appreciate this elegance.
Do you think there would have been any resistance to these sort of ideas?
I think British people were very open and they were fascinated by the Chinese culture and by the difference. That's why we had this major Chinese garden design movement in the 18th century in Britain, because people just loved it.
Yeah. I read a line, it was a plea for irregularity. So is there a way you can kind of try to paint a picture for us about that time during the 1700s? I like this idea, the metaphor of the ideas floating on the wind like these seeds. Give us a sense of the world that they were landing in and how they came to take root?
Yes, I think in the 18th century there was a lot of uncertainty about China, and there was really a lot of admiration. Well, the first reports of Chinese gardens came back from the 16th century onwards from Catholic missionaries. There were drawings, in particular some made by a man called Matteo Ripa, Catholic missionary, who produced the first copper engravings that the Chinese emperor had ever seen. And he was commissioned to make a series of these based on some paintings of the imperial garden. And he brought back some sets of this to Europe, calling in at London. And he had an audience with the king. And the possibility is that some of the influential figures of the time, like the third Earl of Burlington, who was landscaping his estate at Chiswick, might have seen these drawings and started designing in the same way.
Once a few aristocrats were doing it, the fashion took off. Chinese pavilions, bridges, pagodas, and intricate water features started appearing across the country estates of the 17th century Georgian Britain. But the real transformation occurred when the philosophies that underpin the physical structures started to grow their own roots.
There's a letter sent by a French Jesuit missionary called Jardines, and he's talking about the Chinese imperial garden, but it also could be taken to describe the ideal of an English landscape garden of about the same period. And he says they've raised hills and valleys are watered with clear streams. They run on till they form larger pieces of water and lakes. They go from one valley to another, not by formal straight walks as in Europe, but by various turnings and windings, adorned on the sides with little pavilions, and the risings and hills are sprinkled with trees, pieces of rock, placed with so much art you would take it to be the work of nature. So you've got this idea of, it's the complete reverse of the Versailles, the huge straight lines disappearing into the distance. Now straight lines are more or less banished. And if you had a straight walkway, a drive leading up to your house, you'd sweep it away and you'd have a curling one to give you different views from different angles.
The historic gardens here at the Hesticombe Estate in Somerset offer a unique juxtaposition of both formal and naturalistic design approaches.
Hello,
Hi.
Claire. How are you doing?
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. Wow. God, this is very, very beautiful. Well done, I guess. Congratulations. Right, so you're the head gardener here, right?
I am. So this is Hesticombe's formal garden.
So I guess, the basic question is, what makes a formal garden formal?
It's really hard to pinpoint, but I think a lot of it is, it's an informed landscape. It's a designed landscape. It's prettied up with the flowers, I guess. But I think the geometry is part of that. Putting down a hard structure and then filling it with soft nature, if you like.
Yeah, it's interesting, the aspect that you get from being up here is very much you're kind of looking over the garden. You almost can take it all in from this single point.
Yeah, it's really good. And if you imagine in the house, looking out from the top windows onto your garden, so it would have been quite an elitist view, I guess.
Interesting, yeah. It's very interesting, isn't it? If you were used to seeing gardens like this, with that strict geometry, with the house looking over it all and seeing it all as a one-eye, it looks like a carpet that's rolled out in front of you. You can imagine how going to a more naturalistic garden, with all that light and shade and all those kind of hidden objects and structures, you can see why it might be quite radical at the time.
As the Chinese-inspired English landscape garden became the height of fashion in the 18th century, landowner and garden designer Copplestone Bamfield created a wild, winding walk through the grounds of his estate.
They wanted there to be drama all the time in their gardens, and almost like a sense of the fear and wonder of nature. So craggy rock faces and dark spaces, open spaces, taking you on a journey.
Using paintings, original designs and planting plans, the team at Hesticombe have recreated each part of the original Chinese-inspired garden.
It's a great view from
It's
here.
a really good view, isn't it?
It doesn't appear to be a kind of a construct.
It doesn't feel like a garden, does it?
Yeah, right.
And a lot of people walk through here and think this is just the landscape, this is just wild, this is just what walks are like.
Right.
But actually, it's very managed. It's a natural valley that's been manipulated to create this scene, basically. The Chinese seat that we have here is basically a nod to him kind of telling everybody that he knows what's going on. You know, he's aware and he's part of it. He's ahead of his game because he's always got a Chinese seat. So from here, you have a glimpse through to the mausoleum. You don't want to see the whole thing because you want that bit of interest. And then the view across the pond, you get a glimpse of where you've been in the Octagon Summer House down there, and then across the pond in the Vale of Taunton.
The idea of the borrowed view is a big part of every Chinese garden. And there's a whole science attached to this. You have distant borrowed views, which are mostly mountains. You have adjacent views, which could be other buildings. And the idea is you make use of objects which can be seen, which are actually beyond the garden itself, but you calculate very precisely where to put your garden features to make use of those distant views. So instead of everything being laid out like a geometrical pattern, you've got a much more natural garden with a sequence of surprises and views that you only get when you reach a particular point.
Oh my goodness.
It's quite magical, isn't it?
It really is. It does feel a bit like a Chinese garden, looking at it like this.
It's the precision, isn't it? Like that rock definitely has to go there and that fern definitely has to go there, and it's that kind of like manicured nature, I guess.
It's so beautiful that it's kind of...
Doesn't look real, does it?
Doesn't look real.
I think that's the spiritual dimension is what the Chinese gardens try to create. It's beyond the physical dimension.
I quite often will come and rub the quartz stones so that they really gleam. So that's one of the jobs that we do to maintain this view.
I see you've got two brushes.
I've got two
there.
brushes,
Okay.
so you can have a go.
Put me to work.
My background is in fashion and textiles, so I've been to art school, and it's kind of like it's a massive art project.
So it wasn't just the landform and the layout that was changing in the Georgian garden, it was the plants themselves. But how did these Chinese flowering shrubs and trees that we commonly associate with the English garden come to be here in the first place?
Jordan Goodman is a distinguished historian and author, renowned for his extensive publications on cultural exchange and the global history of plants.
So many plants that we take for granted are Chinese. I can just list them, but it would take me to the end of the film to list them all.
Go on,
but a good one is a
bunch.
chrysanthemum,
Right.
magnolia, camellia, hollyhock, hydrangea, gardenia.
I mean, the hydrangea, though, is like, it's so
It's so
synonymous.
British.
It's so British. It's so
But,
synonymous with the British
absolutely.
garden, right?
The camellia would have been very sought after for three reasons. One, it's got beautiful coloring. And the second is you can see it loves the shade, which is very good for a country that doesn't get much sun.
Careful consideration was given to selecting the right plants for import, as it wasn't simply a matter of aesthetic appeal.
So this is the magnolia.
This is a magnolia, but it's not in bloom now because this is a temperate magnolia.
Throughout the 19th century, the world's leading botanists, who also became known as plant hunters, worked with a limited knowledge to select species they believed could thrive in their new environments.
They would mostly come on East India Company ships from Canton, because that's the only place that Europeans were allowed to be. Trouble is that Canton is tropical. So the problem was always to find temperate plants and then do a deal. So they'd say, you give me a few seeds of that and I will give you something from Europe. And these gift exchanges took place all the time.
Okay, so it was a two-way flow.
Two-way flow.
After the initial introduction of these exotic plants to wealthy landowners and the country estates, they gradually began to find their way into urban areas, becoming more widely available in towns and cities.
So can you try and paint a picture for us? When this was the absolute perimeter of London City,
Yeah.
can you try to give us a sense of what that must have been like for them to encounter Chinese plants for the first time?
Well, I think the main thing is increase the color of the environment.
Right, yeah.
So you think of Georgian London as being sort of, brick-colored, and then the Chinese plants, all of those would bring color that you've never seen before.
Yeah. And so would that have been it, ultimately? Like the exoticism of it, the smells and the colors, was that what was driving this?
Oh, for sure.
It's just pure sensory
Absolutely.
pleasure.
Yeah, and it was not from, Holland. It was from some really distant place.
With the fact that it had come so far.
It comes so
from
far,
across the
adds
world.
it to the cachet of it.
And then once you've got it, then I guess the challenge is how to grow it.
How to grow it, how to propagate it, how to make sure it produces seeds so you can pass it on. And that's why the frustration that was felt by a lot of gardeners that they couldn't get anything to grow, which is why they wanted living plants. But living plants require completely other technology.
And what was it that bridged that gap? How were they able to then import live plants?
What you do is you build a greenhouse on the ship.
No way. That's
Yes,
a brilliant...
And you put a gardener.
No.
Yes, to sleep with the plants.
During the plant hunting era, not only did hundreds of exotic species travel from China to the UK, but also traces of the cultural rituals and practices that surrounded them.
This is quite unusual in London, isn't it, to have this many plants on the street?
Like there was an initiative to bring plant life back out of the gardens into the public. And the only way to do it is to put it in pots, which is Chinese.
Right.
Chinese gardens were always in pots.
It's funny, you're talking there, and there's a rich smell of flowers in the air right now, and I'm wondering which one of these that is. God, it's beautiful, isn't it? That's where it's coming from. It is.
All the way down the
that's
street.
amazing. You can smell that from all the way down the other side of the street. Oh, that is amazing, isn't it?
It's intoxicating.
Oh my gosh. And that is a gift. Not just everybody who lives here, but everyone just passing through.
Nature is public by definition.
By the late 18th century, the ideas of Chinese garden design mixed with the English landscape became known as Anglo-Chinoise gardens. And over the following 300 years, this new naturalistic style set seeds in the imagination of garden designers across Europe and can still be found today. The idyllic English garden is celebrated worldwide for its grace and natural beauty. Multi-award-winning garden designer Chris Deacon is at the forefront of this tradition.
For you, what is the kind of quintessential Chinese garden?
Firstly, it's about nature, and reflecting nature. One of the things is a sense of space, to create areas that generated emotion, that resonated with us. And that movement, even in a small space, you can still have that journey and sense of discovery.
Would you say that you had Chinese elements in your garden designs?
Yeah, very much so. That principle underlines everything we do. It's fundamental to good garden design, I would argue. So we've created a room outside that's in scale with the interior room. And we've used materials that also have the same sort of colour palette. And then we've got our focal point at the end, so that's one of the other key points of kind of Chinese design, is to have that focal point to draw us through into the space.
To the untrained eye, there's still quite a lot of straight lines here. It doesn't look overtly Chinese, if you like.
What it is, it's taking the principles behind Chinese design and applying them to our English, I say, contemporary garden design. the flow around the space. So I want to take people on a journey so that they're coming from the house and they've got a reason to go through the garden. Again, scalable structure, bigger trees beyond, then we scale down in height, and then we come down to the textural planting, sweeps and drifts. And again, going back to the sort of the Chinese design principles, they loved contrasting textures. Big leaves next to fine cut leaves, spiky next to round. This is a borrowed landscape, and that's that link, bringing that landscape into the garden. So these also are designed as a pair to draw the eye down and frame the bench as the focal point.
So you're not scared of a bit of symmetry still?
No.
So you're kind of taking from the Chinese style what you like, what you need?
These fundamental principles of Chinese design have underpinned really what we do in British garden design for a long time. It is just good design practice. But if you look at a Chinese garden, well, they're reflecting their landscape. If we were to superimpose a Chinese garden here, we're not reflecting our landscape. So actually, we're breaking one of the principles of their design.
Yeah.
So what we're doing is we're saying, well, what have we got? How do we bring that in, but based on those principles?
What's the perception of English gardening in China, for example?
Well, traditionally, it's been actually quite common for garden designers in this country to go out and recreate English gardens out in places like China and Japan, what we would call a typical rose garden. So they looked to us, funnily enough, for what we've done, how we've adapted their principles and then kind of fed it back. When you create a really successful garden, and it can be any style, but if that speaks to you, if that gives you a sense of well-being, if that gives you a sense of place, if that gives you joy, then that's what gardens are.
For me, walking in a garden like this, it just gives you time. You can't be distracted by anything when you're here. You're just in the moment.
I think by looking at other cultures to see what's happened, what they've done, how they think, we can very much enlarge our own way of thinking.
You relate to the garden the way you relate to your philosophy of life. The pathway is a meander through life, not just a pathway through the garden. You have energy flows. The chi that's running through you is also running through the plant. So you become one with nature, but it's nature on your terms. It's not nature in the wild. You bring the wild into the domestic scene.
Hi. Yeah. Did you plant this? Yeah. Oh my God.
Not a long time ago.
What kind of plant is it? It's a jasmine.
My daughter.
Wow. She's called Jasmine?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
It's impossible to measure the subtle and profound ways these historic cultural exchanges impact our everyday lives, and yet we should always appreciate that these dialogues are ever evolving, with their influence steadily enriching our world.
A lot of Chinese people, when they got older, would retire from Beijing or wherever it was they were and make a garden. So we've done that. Life begins when you make a garden. Would that do?
That'll do fine.